Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Cuff Clarinet, a web series about any and all things related to the clarinet and clarinet playing. So, a couple weeks ago, received a request to cover articulation speed in a video, and again, this is a sort of complex topic, and I've actually addressed the basics of this in a previous video about legato articulation, so I suggest checking that out if you haven't done so. The main point of the legato video is that the air support has to be constant. We have to have each note touching where only the tongue is separating. We're not stopping the airstream. A really good analogy for that, and this probably should have gone in the other video, frankly, but is thinking about a faucet or a water stream. And you can stop the faucet by putting your hand over the top, or you can interrupt the flow of water briefly by moving your hand or your finger underneath, but the source of the water has never shut off. And that's what legato is all about, getting that. Whereas what people tend to do sometimes is to stop the air support actually at the source. This is almost like if you were taking the faucet and sort of turning it on and off for each note. And yes, it's not staccato, it's not short, but they are separate from one another. And legato is sort of the idea of connection of notes rather than having them be separated from one another. So, all of those points in that previous video on legato, which I'll put down in the description of this video so you can refer back to it, those are the basis of articulation speed. And all of those ideas apply. So when you're starting to increase your articulation speed, never think about short. Never think about short. The short is almost created by the speed. If we took a passage from... this is going to be from Weber's Concertino. I'm not thinking about short when I'm playing those 16ths. If I think short, it's going to get really stuck. And even though it's maybe fast enough, it doesn't sound great. So we have to always think about the character and the style of the articulation, not just short and fast. But especially when I was, learning this piece as a young student, had to just think long on these. Because if we think short, we tend to stop our airstream with that. That's pretty much the worst thing you could do when you're trying to articulate. So what I've always found helpful when we're trying to develop articulation speed is to practice in shorter groups. Instead of just going, okay, 16ths all the way, doing short groups. And one exercise that's really helpful for this is sort of the classic. It's from the Langenus book on page 22, this relatively long and then two shorters. And that long two short pattern is great for developing the speed of the tongue in short groups. It's almost like weightlifting in a way, and I probably, if you're sitting there thinking like he doesn't look like he lifts weights, you're right, I don't. So you can discard all of these next 30 seconds if you want. But you can't just sort of lift one giant weight and then expect development. You have to do repetitions, and that's what this exercise does, is you're repeating this pattern of and in those short bursts, you're developing the speed, but the longer note gives you the chance to rest. So an even more basic exercise than that, which I really like, and I use this a lot with my students, and I'll put a link to this in the description of this video, is a very basic exercise that starts off with just legato quarter notes. And what this does is it's a chance to make sure that each note is touching. It really goes back to the legato principle. And then from there, the next step is move the fingers along with that in synchronization with the quarters. And what this does is I find that it gives us an actual shape to help us phrase with our air. If we're just playing one note the whole time, it's kind of boring, frankly, and then the temptation is to back off on the air. But by giving it a shape, slurred first and then articulated ascending quarter notes, what that does is it encourages us to phrase forward with our air support. And then once that's really comfortable, then you add eighth notes to it. And what that sounds like is this. And the idea is, by the time you get to eighth notes, you have enough air support, and you've practiced the legato tongue enough at a quarter note pace, and I start this at quarter note equals 60, but you've practiced the slow legato articulation enough that you can then increase the speed. So then you would do triplets. And then work towards sixteenths. But in the middle of this, you don't just go, quarters, eighths, triplets, sixteenths. Before you move on to the next rhythmic division, you bump the speed up. So instead of maybe jumping straight to eighths from quarters, I would move the quarters up and maybe try it at 100. Because those faster quarters are sort of the bridge, or the sort of filling in the space between quarters and eighths. So when I have students work on this exercise, I'll have them be doing each line at radically different tempos. So, maybe eighths are at 120, triplets are at 100, and then sixteenths are back down at maybe 60 or 70, because you're trying to work on the speed incrementally instead of just, clear gaps between each, more of a linear progression rather than sort of this sort of blocking or terraced approach to this. And again, that's an exercise that I find really helpful, and I'll put that on the in the description for this video so you can check that out for yourself. The other thing to remember about the tongue and articulation speed is that the tongue is a muscle. And that's why that weightlifting analogy earlier is so appropriate. It requires daily practicing and daily maintenance to develop. And if you take a day off or a few days off, I find it can really kind of become sluggish again, or maybe not the greatest quality or most precise placement of articulation. So that's why I really suggest making it a part of your daily warm-up, and I talk about that a bit more in my warm-up video, and I'll put that link down below as well. So I find that daily practice is necessary. The Langinus study that I mentioned earlier is really great for this. This is maybe one of my favorite books. I'm actually doing a lot of work out of this right now, is Kell's 17 Staccato Studies. And what I like about these is they move, depending on which study you use, and they start out very sort of linear motion, like this. And then As you get later, things get a little more complicated, and there's more change of registers. This is one of my least favorites, and by least favorite I mean I always find this one challenging, especially as you get into it, these wide changes of register. And what can happen is that the tongue, when we move registers, I've talked about when it comes to voicing, how the tongue position changes slightly in the oral cavity for each register. But the tongue articulation and placement on the reed has to be pretty much the same to be effective. So we're sort of counteracting these two forces. And always be wary as when you're changing register that the tongue isn't getting lazy or falling down in the oral cavity or moving too far back on the tongue. I know that's something that I am always working toward, is making sure that we're keeping the articulation as clean and as sort of efficient when it comes to economy of motion as possible. So that's also an issue when we get really fatigued. In articulation practice, you have to almost sort of break it up into different chunks instead of just articulating a lot for a very long amount of time. I would suggest, do a little bit and then maybe go to something else and come back to it. That's what I like to do with a lot of these articulation studies from Kell, is maybe work on it once or twice, go practice something else, and then come back when I feel like the tongue has time to recover. Because again, it's a muscle, it gets fatigued, and if you try and push through the fatigue, you end up building bad habits in your articulation, and we don't want that. So the tongue has to move just as little as possible to develop its speed, and it's almost like just that. Not moving radically throughout the oral cavity, depending on what register you're in or what type of articulation. The legato tongue stroke is the key to speed when it comes to articulated passages. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to leave a comment below or reach out on social media. And happy practicing. Good luck with your articulation, and good luck with building up that articulation speed.